Let's bring in our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, who joins us. Michael, we talk about these missiles being used against Russia. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, Storm Shadow seems to have been used. I mean, the Ukrainians are saying that against the chemical plant in Bryansk. And as Deborah was saying, it's quite unusual for them to announce that. I was also looking last night at a series of reports from Russian bloggers who tend to be accurate because they just report what they see. And it looks as if the Ukrainians launched a lot of other attacks using their own weapons as well, like Neptune missiles and the Flamingo missiles and this new the Peklo loitering munition, across a range of Russian regions. And so I think that the Ukrainians are not talking about that, but it's coming out from the Russian side. And Storm Shadow is a very effective missile. It's quite long range, but it's a battlefield weapon.
That's the two in the middle, right?
Yeah, there's two Storm Shadows there under the fuselage of the aircraft. And they're very good because they're hard to defend against, and the Russians certainly know when they've been hit with Storm Shadows. And it looks as if the Ukrainians used a number of Storm Shadows and possibly some of their own, I'm guessing maybe Neptunes, to attack this chemical plant, because getting one bomb on a plant, a big plant, is going to do some damage. You've got to get several bombs on it. And this plant is intrinsic to Russia's, making rocket fuel in particular, but also explosives and precursors for explosives. So the Ukrainians are going after Russia's war infrastructure, whereas the Russians are going after Ukraine's civil infrastructure to try and put the lights out, which they have been doing, create rolling blackouts across Ukraine before the winter. And they're having some success with that. I mean, Chernihiv was hit very badly yesterday. They were without water, without power. And about 8 Russian cities were hit last night in a range of Russian attacks. Sorry, 8 Ukrainian cities were hit in a range of Russian attacks, which are designed to take the power grid offline before the winter really gets moving.
I want to pick up on that point that Deborah made about the fact that it's unusual for the Ukrainians to kind of make this detail so much with regards to the Storm Shadows. Is it more than coincidence that the US says, no, hang on a second, you can't have these Tomahawks. And now Ukraine's going, well, look what we can do with Western weaponry. Look what we can achieve with what the Brits gave us. And there's pressure not just on the Americans, but there's pressure on the Germans as well. They've got a very capable, similar Taurus missile that can count the number of floors it goes down into a building before exploding into the void it needs to, incredibly sophisticated. Is this a bit of show of capacity and strength on the Ukrainian side, not just to Russia, but also to their allies and backers?
I'm sure that's exactly right, Gareth. I mean, I think the Ukrainians want to show they're not beaten, because the narrative in Washington, since the Putin-Trump phone call of last week, and Trump has gone back to, he's gone 180 degrees to where he was 2 weeks ago, and he's now saying the Ukrainians have got to make a deal because they'll be obliterated if they don't. So the narrative has gone back to the idea that the Ukrainians are the victims, there's nothing they can do, the Russians will win. And the Ukrainians are trying to indicate to the Americans, as much as to anyone else, no, we're not beaten. We are able to keep on fighting, and look at what sort of pressure we can build on Russia, not just on the Russian economy into next year, which is what they're trying to do with hitting the refineries in Russia, but also on Russia's war-making capacity. And this chemical plant is a really key part of the technologies that are behind all of the air attacks which the Russians are launching against Ukraine. And Bryansk, of course, is not very far away from the border. No. So if they can get to that chemical factory, I'm sure they'll hit it again if they can. If that factory is as central as the Ukrainians say it is. So yeah, it's a message to the West that they're not finished, and the Russians are doing the opposite. They're saying, it is inevitable.
It's not finished.
Yeah, that it is inevitable that Ukraine will lose, and when the Americans and the Europeans realise that, they'll realise that the longer they support Ukraine, the more people will die. And as Russia, we will never lose, and we don't really care who dies or how many die, as long as we win, and we will. That's their message.
And just briefly, this meeting that was purported to be taking place in Budapest at some point, US putting a lot of cold water on that, Russia a bit more of a kind of holding statement. Meanwhile, we're hearing that Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, heading to Washington. What will he be able to achieve? Yeah,
I mean, he's ahead of the coalition of the willing. So 3 things. So Rutte is in Washington today. Tomorrow the EU meets, and we'll be talking about the frozen Russian assets, making them available to Ukraine, and doing something about the Shadow Fleet. And then on Friday, the coalition of the willing meet again. So there's quite a lot of diplomacy going on now in the West, and partly that's within Europe itself, but it's also to convince the Americans that we, the Europeans, are backing Ukraine. We are on the side of Zelensky. You can be rude to him in the White House if you want to, but we're not going to back off supporting him. That's the message. Whether they'll stick to that message, we don't know, because it's going to get tougher yet over the winter. I mean, it'll get a lot harder than this in the next few months. And so the Europeans are going to have to be a lot braver in the future than they've been in the past if they're to meet the commitments that they've all laid out.
Yes, with regards to the challenges that lie ahead, but they also lie ahead for Russia, no?
Yeah. Oh, they do. I mean, the Russians are on the verge of having to mobilise again. They're trying informally to create the sort of substitute mobilisation, because the last time they mobilised 300,000 troops in 2022, it turned out to be extremely unpopular. And the Russian economy is staggering. It's not going to collapse. It's a big economy, so it's not going to sort of fold like a house of cards. But over the winter and next year, they haven't had a good harvest this year. They're more dependent on China and North Korea than ever. Their interest rates have come down a little bit, but they're still very high. Their manufacturing sector is all bent out of shape by the war. And if the Russian people now realise that this war is not cost-free, this special military operation is actually diminishing their lives, then there may be much more of a sort of grumpiness against it. So far, everyone rallies around the flag. They want their boys to win. But as the costs of the war increase, next year, Russia will have a much bigger economic problem than it's had for the last three.
We'll follow all of it closely for the moment. Michael, appreciate it. Thank you so much.